Mick Mulroy, who spoke to us from Whitefish, Montana. Mulroy is also a former CIA official. Let's take a listen. Mick Mulroy, thank you for joining us on I-24 News. As I'm sure you know, there's still considerable discussion, even debate, about the motives behind the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, especially its timing. How do you assess those, especially those that believe that political motives were a factor here, primarily to escalate tensions with Iran, maybe to make it more difficult for the Biden administration to re-enter the Iran nuclear agreement?
So if you look at the JCPOA and the Trump administration's exit from it, the idea was that the agreement was not very good because it didn't address a lot of the malign activities that Iran has been conducting in the region. So that was the reason for the departure. Since that time, Iran has gone from having roughly 300 kilograms of enriched uranium to 2,400 kilograms of enriched uranium. That indicates that although the strategy was to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon, it is not necessarily working. It is causing economic hardship through the maximum pressure campaign, but to prevent them from gaining a nuclear weapon, it looks like something else needs to be done. So that goes to the assassination. Iran's explanation is that it was a remotely operated machine gun that killed the scientist in question. That's plausible, but unlikely. That's a very sophisticated apparatus that requires a lot of planning. Either way, he is, in fact, assassinated, and that indicates that it was most likely a very sophisticated intelligence service that was involved. Whether it makes it more difficult for the Biden administration, the incoming Biden administration, to rejoin the JCPOA, I think that's likely. This is going to increase the voices of the hardliners in Iran. It's going to decrease the moderates. We have a presidential election coming in Iran in about 6 months, which is going to just further exaggerate this issue. I do think the Biden administration will try to get back into that agreement. Hopefully, they will include issues such as Iran's ballistic missile capabilities and also their use of proxy forces in the region to attack their enemies. So I do think there is still a route back to an agreement, hopefully one that everybody can agree to.
Right. Mick, I want to draw on your practical experience being involved in the years in the CIA, for example, in intelligence operations. How do you assess the potential risks versus the possible benefits that were involved in carrying out, as you say, a sophisticated, presumably very challenging operation of this type?
Yes, from an operations perspective, this was a very complex and sophisticated attack. If they used a remote machine gun that then detonated, that would indicate only the top intelligence services in the world could perform that. It is plausible. I don't think it's likely, but the technology does exist. One belief was that this was done during the transition so that Iran might respond by force, causing an escalation. Hopefully that's not the case. That wouldn't benefit anybody. The other addition to that is that it would actually further prevent any talks going forward into getting back into the JCPOA. But to your question specifically, it does indicate a very sophisticated, well-planned, organized operation. I saw reports that Iran says there was inscriptions on some of the material recovered that indicates Israel. I find that highly unlikely that a service would be this sophisticated to pull this off and then leave some kind of marker that would indicate who it is. But it's definitely impressive from the operational perspective, intelligence operation.
Now, of course, there were people who anticipated some sort of operation or action like this before the Trump administration leaves office. How likely do you see the possibility of even further action, maybe even more escalated action, being taken by the Trump White House in the next couple of months?
So there's a concern that there might actually be an attack on the nuclear facilities that are in Iran. I don't think that's likely. I've certainly heard the media speculation. It's a very significant act. It would require a lot of resources and assets. There'd be a lot of indications that was coming. And I do think it would be a very bad idea during a time of political transition, with that to occur and potentially throw the region into a conflict on the eve of a new administration.
Right. Now, of course, Joe Biden was vice president of the administration that enacted the Iran nuclear agreement with a deep disagreement with the Israeli government. What would be the best course of action for the Biden administration if it wants to re-enter that agreement? And could it find any common ground with the Netanyahu government if it does decide to move forward in that direction?
Yeah, so I think there is common ground between the incoming Biden administration and Prime Minister Netanyahu's government. I think that it is everybody's best interest to have a stable Iran. Right now, the maximum pressure campaign, although it doesn't look like it's stopping Iran from seeking a nuclear weapon, it certainly did cause major economic hardship. And that is destabilizing. And we have a destabilized country with not a lot to gain by maintaining the status quo. They lash out. They'll lash out using proxy forces, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Syria. And I think it's in everybody's interest to get them back to a point where they don't feel that is necessary. So the criticism, I think, is legitimate of the agreement, that it didn't include ballistic missile development and proxy force usage, basically all the malign activities that we're seeing throughout the region and that we've seen increase throughout the region. So it needs to include that. But it's also in, I think, Israel's and the United States' interest to bring Iran back into the League of Nations so that they are a stable and productive country.
Right. Now, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo began a strategic dialogue with Bahrain today. We have a Bahraini delegation in Israel. How crucial role do you see this developing strategic relationship that includes the U.S., Israel, the UAE and Bahrain, and maybe some other countries in the Gulf, more on the quiet side, as a common front against Iran?
So first of all, I think it's a great advancement, so that you see these Gulf countries accepting Israel for what it is, a country in the Middle East that's going to be there forever. So I think that's very positive. It does also indicate that there is a growing alliance, as you said, with Middle Eastern countries against the actions of Iran, which has been incredibly destabilizing, especially if you take Syria, for example. So I do think that indicates that people will see countries cooperating. Hopefully we can use that to our benefit to get a new agreement. Perhaps maybe it doesn't need to be called the JCPOA, but a new agreement that really does address all of the activities that we would like to see Iran not do.
All right. Mick Mulroy, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Thank you for joining us on I-24 News.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.